Years after the Montauk Project was supposedly shut down, a man named Stewart Swerdlow began describing one of the missions he claimed he had been assigned beneath Camp Hero. It wasn't surveillance, and it wasn't remote viewing, and it wasn't another experiment inside the Montauk chair. According to Stewart, the people running the project had discovered that certain children could be programmed, placed inside of a time tunnel, and then sent almost anywhere, any country, any century, and any moment in human history. Once they arrived, they could observe an event, collect information, and manipulate the people involved, or even eliminate someone before history ever knew that person existed. Stewart claimed he was selected for one of these missions, and the target was a man living nearly 2,000 years ago. A man whose death would eventually become the foundation of the largest religion on earth. And according to Stewart, the order was simple: travel back in time, find Jesus Christ, and kill him. But that wasn't the strangest part of this mission, because Stewart claimed that when he arrived, he discovered the people running Montauk had misunderstood who or what they were sending him to find. And when he eventually arrived, he began to suspect that the United States government wasn't the only organization operating beneath Camp Hero. There were other groups involved, other facilities, and according to him, other forms of intelligence. Some of them may not have even been human. In part one of the Montauk Project, we followed the experiments beneath Camp Hero until August of 1983, when Duncan Cameron allegedly pulled something out of his own subconscious and gave it a physical body. And that creature tore through the facility. The equipment was destroyed, the time tunnel collapsed, and the project was supposedly over. But closing Camp Hero did not end the conspiracy. It did something much, much worse. It scattered it. Because once people began following the stories behind the gates of Montauk, they discovered another restricted government facility on an island just across the water. A facility that really did experiment on living creatures. A facility with a documented connection to biological warfare. And a facility surrounded by rumors of genetic manipulation, engineered diseases, and animals that were never supposed to leave the island alive. Then, decades after Montauk was supposedly shut down, something washed ashore. No one could agree on what it was, but before it could be properly examined, the body disappeared. And suddenly the question was no longer what had happened underneath Camp Hero. The question was now, how far did this project spread? This is part 2 of the Montauk Project. And this time, we are going beyond the gates of Camp Hero itself. Welcome to Spicy Alien After Dark. All right. Is everyone hydrated? Are we all, do we have snacks? Are you at work? Or maybe you're in your car on your way to work, wherever you are. First and foremost, thank you for listening to Spicy Alien After Dark, and welcome back to part 2 of Montauk. You guys loved this first episode of Montauk, and I'm so thrilled because I feel like I'm finding a groove in what you guys are really wanting to listen to. And these really deep, dark conspiracy theories that kind of scatter all over the place are seemingly the it spot right now. So if that's true, tell me down in the comments if there's any other conspiracy theories you want me to deep dive into. Please let me know. I am working on an email for submissions for your own spooky stories or any other type of conspiracies that you want me to investigate. So stay tuned for that. Also, if you're not already subscribed to Spicy Alien After Dark, please do so. It really is helpful. It helps me out. I'm trying to get accepted into like the creator rewards program on Spotify. And if you follow this channel, it really, really helps. The other thing is, if you want an extra full-length episode of Spicy Alien After Dark, please sign up for our Spotify tier. We have gone into some crazy cases on that side of Spotify, so please subscribe to that tier. It's amazing. If you are not following me on all of my socials, I will drop them in the description of this episode. I've got merch in the works too, guys. I'm really excited. Hopefully next week sometime the merch store will be live. I cannot believe I'm even saying that. This is so exciting. Thank you so much for being here and listening. And without further ado, let's get into Montauk Part 2. Again, if you don't have snacks and some drinks, I suggest you grab some now. So, you guys, to understand what happened after Montauk, you have to look at a map. Camp Hero sits on the very end of Long Island's South Fork. It's almost as far east as you can travel in New York before the land just simply stops. And beyond that radar tower, the abandoned bunkers and the concrete batteries, there's nothing but ocean. But if you move west along the coastline and look across the water from the eastern end of Long Island's North Fork, another piece of land appears. And it's small, relatively, roughly 3 miles long, covered in forests and marshes and more abandoned military structures and laboratories, hidden from the public view. That island is called Plum Island, and for most of its modern history, ordinary people have been absolutely forbidden from going there. There are no public ferries, there's no hotels there, and there's no beaches that you and I can visit and spread out some towels on. It's just not going to happen. They don't want you to do that. Access has been controlled by the federal government, and the waters surrounding that island have very, very much been heavily monitored. So that alone would have been enough to generate the rumors that precede Plum Island itself. But the real history of Plum Island is considerably stranger than the rumors needed it to be, because this is all documented. Before it became a laboratory, Plum Island was home to Fort Terry, a coastal defense installation built to protect the entrance of Long Island Sound. Its placement was strategic. Ships traveling towards New York, Connecticut, or the industrial ports along Sound would have to pass near it. And during the First and Second World Wars, the island was filled with soldiers, artillery positions, storage facilities, and observation posts. And then the war ended, and the weapons were removed, and the soldiers definitely left. And in 1952, the United States Army Chemical Corps took control of Plum Island. And that's where this island's history changes. The Army began converting old military buildings into laboratories designed to study biological agents that could be used against animals. Yep. The mission involved something called anti-animal biological warfare. And instead of developing a weapon intended to kill enemy soldiers directly, researchers studied diseases capable of destroying livestock. Yeah, imagine what that could do during a war. No cattle means no meat, and there's no dairy, fewer animals to work the land itself. There would be food shortages spread through civilian population, and then the economy of wherever this is begins to buckle completely. An enemy could devastate an entire country without dropping a bomb on one of its cities. One of the central locations connected to this type of work was Building 257. The structure had originally been constructed as a military storage building, but after the Chemical Corps arrived, it was renovated for biological research. And labs were installed. Animal holding areas were prepared. Specialized containment systems were added. And then in 1954, control of Plum Island was transferred from the Army to the United States Department of Agriculture. What? Publicly, the mission became defensive pretty much immediately. Plum Island Animal Disease Center would study foreign diseases that threatened American livestock, particularly illnesses considered too dangerous to research on the mainland. So pretty scary right off the bat, because if anything gets out of this place, it's a threat to everyone. One of its primary targets was foot and mouth disease. This particular illness spreads extraordinarily quickly among animals with divided hooves, like cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. An infected animal can develop a fever and painful blisters around the mouth and feet, and it may stop eating and it may struggle to stand even. But most importantly, milk production collapses. The disease rarely kills adult animals directly, but an outbreak can rip through farms so rapidly that enormous numbers of animals must be slaughtered to stop it. And keeping that research on an island made plenty of sense. Water created a natural barrier, and access could definitely be controlled. If something went wrong, the pathogen would theoretically remain separated from livestock on the mainland. But an island is not a sealed laboratory. Birds can fly across water, and insects are carried by the wind. Employees even arrive and leave by boat, and equipment is transported back and forth. Waste has to go somewhere, right? And the public was expected to trust that whatever entered Plum Island would never leave it. For decades, the federal government maintained that the work conducted there was designed to protect American agriculture, and that was true. But it wasn't the entire story, nor was it the entire history of the island. Plum Island's original biological warfare mission remained largely outside public awareness until journalists uncovered documents showing that the Army Chemical Corps really had intended to study anti-animal biological agents there. And the details immediately changed the way people viewed the island. The laboratory had not simply been a place for an inside military base. The military had deliberately chosen the island for biological warfare research before the Department of Agriculture inherited it, and the transition between those two missions was not as clean as the public had been led to believe. The researchers did not arrive on an empty island, and they inherited buildings and equipment and containment infrastructure and an existing military interest in using disease as a weapon. Plum Island also experienced genuine safety concerns, and in 1978, foot and mouth disease escaped from one section of the laboratory into animals being held elsewhere on that island. It did not reach the mainland, but the incident proved that containment could fail. In years later, additional internal incidents raised concerns about aging equipment, human error, emergency preparedness, and the condition of the laboratory's infrastructure. Employees and contractors would eventually make allegations about dangerous practices on the island, and government investigators and members of Congress questioned whether certain research could be conducted safely. Most of those concerns involved livestock diseases, workplace safety, and the possibility of an accidental release. But in the communities surrounding Plum Island, that distinction began to disappear. People knew dangerous pathogens were being kept there. They knew animals were being intentionally infected, and they knew the island once had been connected to biological warfare. They also knew that they are not allowed to see what is happening there. And then people began connecting Plum Island to a second abandoned military base that was nearby, Camp Hero. And suddenly the two facilities seemed to fit together far too easily. Camp Hero was rumored to have experimented on the human mind, and Plum Island experimented on animal bodies. Camp Hero allegedly manipulated memory, consciousness, and psychic ability, and Plum Island studied infection, transmission, and biological response. Both of those had military histories, and both sat at the remote eastern edge of Long Island. Both contained restricted areas, abandoned structures, and facilities the public could not freely enter. And, according to the growing Montauk mythology, both extended much, much farther underground than anything visible from the surface. So the question was clearly asked, were these really two separate facilities, or were they different departments of the same project? When Camp Hero was officially, allegedly, decommissioned, much of the land was eventually transferred to the state of New York. Today, You and I can both hike there. Anybody can go hike Camp Hero. They can also ride bicycles along the old military roads. Anyone can go fish from the coastline and walk through forests that have grown around the remains of the infrastructure of the base. But Camp Hero does not feel like an ordinary state park. Far from it. There are concrete buildings that sit behind fences, and there's old batteries that are buried beneath grass and soil. There are steel doors that have been welded shut. There are entrances that have just been covered with earth by now. It's been sitting abandoned, quote unquote, for so long that it's just being reclaimed by nature at this point. But above everything stands that enormous radar tower, that same structure that Preston Nichols claimed once transmitted experiments across Montauk. The tower itself is impossible to ignore. It is massive, and it's a reflector that still hangs above the trees. It points towards the sky as if somebody walked away in the middle of an operation and just never came back. So, for Montauk conspiracy believers, the strangest part of Camp Hero has always been what remains beneath it. Some underground construction is completely expected, and Camp Hero was a military installation designed to survive an attack. It requires storage rooms, protected communication systems, utility lines, ammunition spaces, command posts, and fortified areas where personnel could continue operating if bombs were to fall directly above them. There are real bunkers there, real buried structures, real utility systems, and there are just real underground rooms there. That documented construction became the foundation for a much larger claim, though. Preston Nichols described an enormous facility descending beneath Camp Hero, and different accounts vary, but some versions contain multiple subterranean levels, very long corridors, laboratories, living quarters even, medical areas, computer rooms, and chambers large enough to house equipment that could have never entered through the doors visible above ground. If a complex that large existed, it created an obvious logistical problem, and that was how could hundreds of workers arrive without being noticed? How could concrete, steel, wiring, food, water, machinery, and fuel be transported through small coastal communities without anybody asking any questions? How could enormous pieces of experimental equipment be moved into Camp Hero after portions of the base had supposedly just been abandoned? But Montauk conspiracy theorists answered that problem with tunnels. And according to this conspiracy, the visible entrances were never the primary way into this facility. Personnel and equipment supposedly moved through an underground network connecting Camp Hero to other military and government locations. Some accounts claimed that the passages extended beneath Montauk itself. Others described access points hidden in buildings away from the main base. Former roads, sealed elevators, concealed railway systems, and underwater tunnels that all became part of the legend were eventually, or rumored, the destination that appeared again and again and again. And that was Plum Island. The idea of an underwater tunnel beneath the two sites is one of the most persistent claims surrounding the expanded Montauk conspiracy theory. No publicly available blueprint confirms that tunnel, but geography would make the construction itself an enormous undertaking. The two locations are separated by water, difficult seabed, and enough distance that a secret passage would require a major engineering operation. It would need ventilation and drainage, electrical power, maintenance, and emergency exits. It would also produce huge quantities of excavated material that would have to be transported or at least concealed. A tunnel capable of moving vehicles or laboratory equipment would be even more difficult to hide. But people who believe the connection existed argue that the absence of a direct tunnel or ordinary maps means pretty much nothing to them. Both facilities were controlled by the military, and both were involved in Cold War defenses. Secret underground construction was hardly unheard of during that period, and also, to be fair, to this day, nobody actually knows what the US government is up to. And on top of that, the United States government really did build hidden facilities designed to survive nuclear war. So, again, just because nobody saw it doesn't mean it didn't happen. If a tree falls in the wood type shit, you know what I mean? Underneath the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, the government secretly constructed an enormous bunker intended to shelter Congress during an attack. And for decades, hotel guests walked above it without knowing it existed. The complex contained dormitories, meeting rooms, medical facilities, communications equipment, and a massive blast door. And that remained secret until 1992. Just saying. Elsewhere, the government built hardened command centers inside of mountains, underground missile control facilities, and protected communication networks stretching across enormous distances. There's the history there, right? But that in itself doesn't prove that there's a tunnel beneath Long Island. But the simple fact that the US government has already done all of these things kind of just destroyed the argument that large underground equipment was never hidden. You know what I mean? Because large underground government facilities had always been hidden and continue to this day. And sometimes thousands of people lived or worked near them without understanding what was beneath their feet. The Camp Hero rumors gained more attention when investigators began using ground-penetrating technology around the property. Christopher Garetano, I think is how you say his last name, the filmmaker behind Montauk Chronicles, later participated in an investigation of the base for the History Channel program, The Dark Files. This team used electrical imaging, which is a method that sends electrical currents through the ground and measures distances in resistance. Solid rock, disturbed soil, water, metal, and empty spaces could produce different readings. Actually, if you're familiar with the TV show Skinwalker Ranch, that's what they use underground on the ranch to see if there are any hot spots, so to speak, in areas that are receiving a lot of like paranormal activity. It's ground penetrating radar, essentially, is what it is. And it creates a picture of density. According to Garetano, the testing revealed an anomaly beneath the property consistent with some kind of underground space. It didn't reveal like a 12-level laboratory. It didn't show a tunnel that reached Plum Island. I don't think it could at that point, but it suggested that there could be more beneath Camp Hero than the accessible structures revealed. And for believers, that was enough. So they kept digging, and stories circulated about people finding ventilation shafts hidden in the woods. Others reported warm air rising from places where no active facility was even supposed to exist. And there were accounts of electrical humming beneath the ground, sealed doors inside abandoned structures, and concrete poured over possible access points. Urban explorers claim to have entered tunnels before entrances were closed, and some described flooded passageways, some described rooms filled with abandoned equipment that they couldn't really describe or understand how they worked. Others insisted that certain corridors ended at walls that looked newer than the structures surrounding them, as if someone had sealed the passage from the other side. The problem was that every real piece of military infrastructure made the unverified stories harder to separate from reality, if you will. A drainage system became an escape route. An ammunition passage became a laboratory entrance. And with every sealed door created the same irresistible question: why seal it unless there was something behind there, you know? And there are practical answers to this. Abandoned military structures are dangerous, and they don't want the public getting in there and hurting themselves. These structures contain collapsing ceilings and exposed metal, contaminated soil, standing water, asbestos, old fuel tanks, and electrical equipment. The Army Corps of Engineers had documented environmental cleanup at Camp Hero, including the removal of underground storage tanks and transformers. So closing an entrance does not prove that there are experiments happening behind it. But Camp Hero's atmosphere works against every ordinary explanation. The buildings were deliberately designed to be deceiving. And during the Second World War, some coastal defense structures were disguised to resemble ordinary homes. If you remember, we talked about in part 1 They designed Camp Hero to look like an ordinary fishing village. Literally, they had painted on false windows, and from above, they wanted this entire area to just look like a quiet, peaceful town, living a quiet, peaceful coastal life. Camouflage was built into Camp Hero from the beginning, and the base was created to hide what it actually was. So, when officials later told people that there was nothing else concealed beneath the property, they were making that statement about a facility that they'd already lied about. And the purpose of it had already been based on deception. And then you add to that Plum Island. The island possessed its own military ruins and laboratories, utility systems, power generation, water treatment, animal holding areas, and secured transportation. It already functioned as a self-contained federal world. Wild mammals found on the island were reportedly killed to prevent them from carrying pathogens to the mainland. Animals used in research were controlled. Materials leaving the facility were supposed to be disinfected or destroyed, and the entire operation depended on preventing biological material from crossing the water. Yet, the expanded Montauk conspiracy claimed things had crossed between the two facilities for years, like equipment or research subjects or biological samples. And eventually, that all turned into transporting non-human entities. The theory proposed that Camp Hero's experiments had opened contact with forms of intelligence that the researchers did not fully understand. And once that contact was established, the project allegedly needed somewhere to study the physical side of the interaction. Tissue, blood, genetics, reproduction, the biological limits of the human body. And Plum Island already was equipped to contain infected animals and restricted biological material, so why not non-human entities? It was the ideal location. And within the conspiracy, the rumored tunnel now served a very specific purpose. Camp Hero had handled the consciousness part of the experiments, and Plum Island handled the biology, and something moved between them. The idea could have remained another anonymous rumor attached to two secretive facilities. Then a man began publicly describing what he claimed had happened to him as a child. Again, think back to part 1. His story went far beyond anything Preston Nichols had originally revealed. He described being taken from his home during the very late hours of the night. He claimed he would regain consciousness naked and immobilized and strapped to a table inside a cold underground room. The walls appeared to be cut from rock and water collected on the floor. People moved around him while he was unable to speak, and at first, he believed they were trying to discover whether he possessed psychic abilities. And then they began teaching him how to use them, how to enter another person's mind, how to accept commands without remembering who had given them, and how to travel somewhere his physical body had never been before, how to kill a target without ever touching them. And his name was Stewart Swerdlow. And according to Stewart, the children beneath Montauk were being prepared for a war most of humanity didn't know had already begun. Stewart Swerdlow did not remember arriving at Camp Hero through a gate. He didn't remember being driven past a guard station or walking beneath the radar tower. His memories began after he was already underground. He would open his eyes and find himself lying on a table, naked, unable to move, and unable to call out for help. The room itself was dimly lit. Its walls appeared rough and unfinished, as though the chamber had been carved directly into the rock beneath Long Island. The air felt cold against his skin, and sometimes there were people standing around him. Other times, he believed he wasn't alone with people at all. Stewart would eventually claim that these experiences began when he was just 13 years old, sometime around 1970. But according to him, his connection to the program had begun years earlier. Stewart said that as a child, he experienced visions he could not explain. He would see places that he never actually visited, and people that he'd never met. Scenes in his mind that didn't appear to belong to the present time. Some seemed to come from the past, and others apparently completely outside of ordinary time. He claimed he could sense what people were thinking before they even spoke. He experienced dreams that felt less like dreams and more like memories almost, and sometimes those memories appeared to belong to somebody else entirely. But Stewart believed his abilities were connected to his family. His birth name was Stewart Cogden. His mother's family name was Swerdlow, and through that side of the family, Stewart claimed a connection to Yakov Sverdlov, a powerful Bolshevik revolutionary who became a chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee after the Russian Revolution. Stewart would later argue that this ancestry mattered big time. He claimed his family contained people involving politics, intelligence, and espionage. According to Stewart, the groups of people operating Montauk weren't searching randomly for unusual children. They were studying families. They wanted children who possessed natural psychic sensitivity, but they also wanted children whose relatives had connections to government, military organizations, intelligence agencies, occult societies, or powerful institutions of some sort. That child's ability was only one part of the selection process, and the bloodline was the other. Stewart believed that his family had already been observed before he was even born, and according to his account, the project knew what he might be capable of long before anyone brought him beneath Camp Hero. And then, around the beginning of adolescence, the missing time begins. He would go to sleep in his own bed, and hours later, he would wake up somewhere else. Sometimes the transition was clean. One moment he was home, the next he would be staring at those stone walls beneath the ground. Other times, only fragments remained in his memory. It was either the sound of machinery or bright lights flashing above his face. Groups of hands would be attaching something to his body, and voices would be speaking around him as though he weren't conscious at all. Then he would wake up at home again. There was no ordinary journey between those places. There was no memory of a vehicle, no recollection of returning home. There was simply just a hole in the middle of his life. And somewhere inside that hole was Montauk. Stewart claimed the early sessions were designed to answer one question: how much could his mind withstand? The people running the program weren't immediately teaching him to use his psychic abilities. According to his version, they first needed to destroy the mental structures that made him an individual. His sense of safety, his trust in other people, his understanding of time, his attachment to his body, even the certainty that his memories belonged to him. Everything needed to go, and the techniques Stewart described were absolutely brutal. Subjects were allegedly restrained for long periods of time. They were exposed to extreme temperatures, painful sounds, strobing lights, electric shocks, drugs like MK Ultra projects, sensory deprivation, and terrifying imagery. Some were starved. Some were threatened. Some were placed in situations where they believed they were about to just die. Then, shortly before the mind completely collapsed, the pressure would stop. A calm voice might enter the room. Someone might offer water, warmth, food, or reassurance, and that person became safety. And then the entire process would begin over again. Pain and relief, terror and comfort, punishment and reward. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I kind of like these ideas, I'm not going to lie. Anyway, moving on. The subject gradually learned that survival depended on surrendering control to whoever operated the experiment. And this wasn't only intended to frighten a child. Stewart believed the purpose was to split the mind. Under overwhelming trauma, subjects' consciousness would supposedly fracture into separate compartments. One part of the personality could continue living an ordinary life. It could attend school and speak with family, eat dinner at the dinner table, and go to sleep while consciously knowing what had happened. And then another compartment would hold Montauk. That part remembered the underground rooms. It understood commands. It knew how to perform the task it had been trained to perform. And according to Stewart, that compartment could be activated without the everyday personality ever understanding what it had just done. The project could create a person who carried their own handler inside of their mind. Once the compartments had allegedly been created, they needed doors. Stewart said the programmers used specific triggers to open them. A word, a number, a color, a tone, a sequence of symbols. An image flashed onto a screen, something that is so ordinary that the subject might encounter it without realizing it had been deliberately placed there in their mind. And when the correct trigger appeared, the programmed personality surfaced. It might last for minutes, it might last for hours, then another signal would close it. The person could then return to consciousness without any memory of the missing periods. Stewart also described something called the language of hyperspace. He said the program used colors, archetypes, and geometric symbols to communicate directly with the deeper levels of the mind. A symbol did not function like a written sentence. It carried an entire concept all at once. If the mind had been conditioned properly, a shape could produce a physical response, release a memory, suppress an emotion, or deliver an instruction before the conscious brain had time to resist it. Different colors allegedly affected different layers of thought. Different geometric forms were associated with protection, movement, communication, or control. The project, in Stewart's telling, wasn't merely teaching children to obey spoken orders. It was constructing a private operating system inside of them. One that only the programmers knew how to access. And this is where this story begins to intersect with something very, very real. Years before Stewart published his account, the CIA had conducted experiments under MK Ultra and related programs involving hypnosis, drugs, sensory deprivation, behavioral conditioning, and the possibility of creating unwitting agents. Project MK Ultra was a real thing. This is documented in our history. That was the United States government. Okay? It's real. It's there. Some subjects were exposed without any consent. Some records were destroyed. A lot of records were destroyed, actually. And the known program does not prove Stewart's story, but it does establish that American intelligence agencies had seriously explored whether memory, identity, and behavior could be manipulated. This was already done. And Stewart believed Montauk was what happened when that research was moved into the darkness and stripped of every limitation. MK Ultra attempted to control a mind, and Montauk allegedly attempted to completely redesign one. One of Stewart's devices that he described was a visual programming screen. The subject would be positioned in front of it while images moved rapidly across the surface. So think a screen is on the wall, you're placed in front of the screen, and things like symbols, faces, colors, and it gets pretty violent because even like violent scenes and like religious imagery were shown. Places that they had never visited were shown too, and the images might appear too quickly for one's conscious mind to be able to study it, but Stewart said that was the point. The information was intended to pass beneath conscious awareness. Sounds played at the same time that all of this imagery was flashing. Some could be heard. Others were allegedly transmitted as frequencies designed to affect the nervous system without forming recognizable words. Just as a pause here for just a second, okay? Think about what you see on social media. If your algorithm is anything like mine, I do tend to get a lot of health messaging around our nervous systems. We are just now, as a public, as citizens, learning about our nervous system being way more than we thought it was. And we are talking about, at the time of the Cold War, the government already knew this, and they were doing experiments and testing it to see what it could withstand or be programmed to do. Just let that sink in for a second. Drugs, electrical stimulation, and the signal from the radar equipment were supposedly used to make the mind more receptive to this imagery and sound. Then the instructions would follow. Stewart claimed that programmers could build entire fabricated environments inside of a subject's memory. A person could remember entering a room that never even existed. They could remember meeting someone they had never seen before, and they could believe that they had spent days in a location when only a few hours had passed. Real experiences could be covered by manufactured ones. A terrifying underground session might be replaced with the memory of a normal night's sleep, but Stewart claimed the replacement memories were rarely perfect. Details leaked through, a sound appeared in a dream, a hallway seemed unfamiliar, or a stranger's face produced sudden panic. A person would recognize a location that they had never consciously visited, and sometimes the body remembered what the conscious mind did not. Stewart said certain smells, electrical sounds, underground rooms, and flashes of particular colors could trigger physical reactions before he even understood why. His heart would begin racing, his muscles would tighten, and images pushed upward from somewhere he couldn't consciously reach. That's how he believed his memories of Montauk eventually began to return to him, not as a complete story, but just as pieces. Now, according to Stewart, once the programmers believed they had control over the mind, they began testing what that mind could do. At first, the assignments were observational. He would be given a name or an image of a location and instructed to describe it. A room in another building, a military installation, a person somewhere outside of Montauk. He claimed he could focus on that target and then allow impressions to form. Temperature, color, movement, the arrangement of objects, the emotional state of the people inside, and this resembled remote viewing, the attempt to perceive a distant target without physically being present. And as we already know from Project Stargate, the United States government genuinely funded and investigated remote viewing research during the Cold War times. Again, already something that is documented and happened. Our government did this. They performed experiments like this. They spent our money on this, which I'm not saying was a waste because you could learn something from it, but just to the skeptics out there, this was something our government was doing during the Cold War. At Montauk, Stewart claimed the process was more invasive, though. Researchers didn't simply ask him to observe a target, they trained him to enter the target. He described projecting his consciousness away from his own physical body and into another location. In that state, walls were supposedly less important, distance became irrelevant, and the subject could move through a facility, search for information, locate a person, and return with impressions of what they had seen. The perfect spy doesn't need a passport. They wouldn't cross a border. They wouldn't be photographed breaking into a building. And if they were caught, there would be no physical intruder to arrest. But observation was only the beginning. The next question was whether these subjects could affect the target. As in, could they enter another person's thoughts? Could they plant a suggestion? Could they create fear without revealing its source? Could they influence a decision? Could they make someone hear a voice that appeared to come from inside their own mind? Stewart claimed they trained subjects to project images and emotions towards other people. A target might suddenly become riddled with anxiety. They might feel watched. They might start to distrust someone that they trusted moments earlier. They could experience a thought that felt completely natural and never suspect that, according to the experiment, the thought had been deliberately placed in their mind. The advantage was obvious. If you can control what a person thinks, you don't have to physically force them into doing anything. They believed the decision was their own, and then the assignments just became a lot darker from that point on. Stewart alleged that the Montauk children were being developed for covert operations. Some would collect information, some would influence individuals, and others were trained as psychic weapons. The project wanted to know whether a subject could harm someone at a distance using nothing but direct intention. Stewart described concentrating on specific systems inside a target's body: the heart, the brain, the nervous system, there it is again, The subject was allegedly taught to visualize that system malfunctioning. A target would then become disoriented, or they might experience sudden pain, or they might lose consciousness. And in the most extreme version of this claim, the psychic operator could cause death without leaving an identifiable weapon behind. No bullet, no poison, and no attacker captured on camera. Just again, I need to pause here for a second. If the US government knew how effective visualization was back then, does that not say something for how we live our lives right now? Just a motivational break at this point. I know this is a dark episode, but pause for a second. If the government knew about visualization and how powerful it was back in the day, imagine what we can do with that information today. Imagine what you can use. Imagine what you could do for your own life if you knew that the government was using visualization as a tool to, kill people. But what if you and me started using visualization as a tool to get the life that we want? I, for the past 6 months, have been visualizing the way that I want my life to be led, and I now have a podcast, and my job is social media. I used to work a miserable corporate job, and now I get to do this. And I'm not saying it's all because of visualization, but I am saying that I wouldn't be here if I didn't start doing that. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm on one today. Anyway, back to this disturbing, crazy conspiracy theory. A person could collapse from what appeared to be a natural medical disaster, but the individual responsible might be hundreds or thousands even miles away, perhaps even unaware of what their programmed personality had just done. Stewart claimed that this purpose was the true purpose behind certain assassination exercises. The researchers were testing whether consciousness could become a weapon with no physical signature, but psychic influence was unreliable and a subject's emotions could start to interfere. A target might resist, the connection could be lost. So Montauk allegedly developed another method. If the operator couldn't reach the target through consciousness alone, the project could send the operator directly to them. But that required the time tunnel. Okay? Buckle the fuck up. All right. The time tunnel that we established in part 1 of Montauk had supposedly begun as an opening created through Duncan Cameron's amplified mind. But Stewart claimed that the program eventually learned how to stabilize it. A destination could be selected and the entrance would form inside of the facility. Beyond it, the subject might see another location, another period, or something that didn't appear to belong to Earth at all. And early missions were allegedly designed to collect information. The subject would be sent to observe historical events, and they were supposed to watch without interacting with anyone or anything, and then return and report what they had seen. But the program quickly encountered a problem, obviously. The past did not always resemble the version recorded in books. Go figure. Stewart claimed events unfolded differently. Historical figures looked different. Certain people appeared where they were never supposed to have been. And some events seemed constructed or deliberately hidden. And the researchers began to realize that time travel could provide something far more valuable than any historical knowledge. It could provide control over history itself. A document could be removed before anyone found it. An object could be planted where it would later be discovered. A witness could be frightened into silence, and a person could be killed before they completed the action that made them important. If the mission succeeded, no one in the present would know anything had even changed, and their version of history would simply be the version that they remembered. Stewart claimed Montauk sent subjects to different periods under tightly controlled conditions. The child would be programmed with an identity suitable for the destination. Language could allegedly be placed into the activated compartment, and clothing and instructions would be prepared, and then the subject would just enter the tunnel. But there was another problem. The human mind did not respond well to being removed from its own time. Stewart described disorientation, memory loss, nausea, emotional collapse, and the terrifying sensation that different versions of reality were occupying the same space. A person might return remembering events that no longer happened because they had just changed the course of history, and they might recognize people who did not recognize them. They could carry memories from more than one possible timeline and lose the ability to determine which life was their own. And for an adult, that's pretty devastating. For a child whose identity had already been deliberately fractured, it could make them almost impossible to restore. And perhaps that's why the project used them like this. A mind that had already been divided could hold incompatible realities in separate compartments. One personality remembered the mission, another returned home. Of all of the missions that Stewart later described, one became more infamous than the rest, and he claimed Montauk ordered him to travel into ancient Judea and assassinate Jesus Christ. The plan, as Stewart told it, was not simply to kill a religious figure. It was an attempt to interfere with the development of human belief. If Jesus died at the wrong moment, or if certain events surrounding his life never occurred, the consequences would spread across centuries. Empires might develop differently. Wars might never happen. Institutions controlling millions of people might cease to exist, or another system of control could take its place. So, Stewart entered the tunnel believing he knew who his target was. But according to him, the man he encountered did not match the story that he had been taught. Stewart later referred to him as Jmanuel. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but the spelling is Jmmanuel. Jmanuel. He claimed that the identity, appearance, history, and teachings of this figure had been altered over centuries, which, duh. In Stewart's version, the mission exposed a conflict much larger than Montauk. Religious history had allegedly been shaped by competing groups, each attempting to influence humanity's understanding of itself. The people controlling Montauk wanted to access the original event because whoever controlled that moment could potentially control everything built from it. Stewart said he did not complete the assassination. Exactly what he believed happened during the encounter became tangled with his later claims about altered timelines, hidden bloodlines, and non-human interference in human religion. Montauk was no longer trying to predict history, it was trying to go back and edit it. And Stewart's refusal, or failure, I guess, to carry out the assignment raised a dangerous question for the program. Could a program subject disobey? And if the answer was yes, then somewhere inside the fractured mind, a piece of the original person was still alive. And the deeper Stewart's alleged memories went, the less human the projects became. At first, he remembered doctors, military personnel, technicians, handlers, people in uniforms and laboratory clothing, all pretty classic with signs of underground military bases. But then other figures began to appear. He described small beings with gray skin, large heads, thin bodies, and enormous dark eyes. The creatures commonly called the Greys. Some appeared to move through the facility freely. They weren't imprisoned. They weren't being treated as unexpected visitors. They behaved like they were personnel. Stewart claimed the Greys participated in medical procedures, genetic collection, neurological examinations, and the study of human emotional responses. Side note, at one point, I want to dive into the entire history of the Greys because it is fascinating. And it's also one of those things that just goes and goes and goes and goes into all sorts of crazy shit. So anyway, back to it. Their movements seemed pretty mechanical, their reactions were difficult to read, and he began to wonder whether they were fully biological beings or bodies designed to perform specific tasks. Then he encountered something else. Really tall figures, heavily built and covered in scales, with faces that appeared more reptilian than human. Stewart claimed some of them could hide their appearance, almost like they were shape-shifting. A being might initially resemble a tall human, and then that image would distort or collapse, revealing something else underneath it. Within his later account, the disguise was not traditional clothing or makeup. It was a technological or psychic projection that altered what the observer perceived. These beings appeared to occupy a different position than the Greys. The Greys performed procedures, and the reptilian entities gave orders. And if Stewart's memories were accurate, the human personnel working beneath Camp Hero did not treat these entities as prisoners, specimens, or guests. They were partners, possibly even superiors. And that changed the entire question surrounding Montauk, because until now we have assumed that human beings created the project and eventually lost control of what they built. But Stewart believed human researchers had entered into an agreement of sorts. Technology was being exchanged, access was being granted, people were then provided. And the children beneath Camp Hero may have been part of the payment, so to speak. The non-human groups weren't only interested in what the children could do with their minds, they were interested in what was hidden inside of their blood. According to Stewart, every child brought beneath Montauk was examined. Blood was drawn, hair was collected, tissue samples were taken, family histories were even investigated. The researchers weren't simply measuring psychic performance, they were searching for patterns. Why could one child remote view while another couldn't? Why did certain subjects survive the programming? Why could some enter the time tunnel without mentally collapsing? And why did some children appear capable of perceiving the beings operating inside the facility while others didn't see shit? And Stewart believed the answer was actually genetic. The project wasn't creating these abilities from nothing, it was searching for people who already carried them. And according to Stewart, the children selected for Montauk shared something that connected them not only to one another, but to the non-human beings waiting beneath the base. We're going to take a deep dive here, and it's going to get fucking weird. If it hadn't already gotten weird, it's going to get weirder, okay? And listen, don't come at me. I'm just your host. It's just me, Spicy Alien. I'm not a gray, though. I'm not a reptilian. I'm just your friendly neighborhood alien, all right? Don't come at me for the stuff that's going on under Montauk. I didn't do it. It wasn't me or my fam. According to Stewart, the people beneath Montauk were searching for something specific. Natural psychic ability was valuable, and a child who could perceive distant locations, influence other people's emotions, or survive the time tunnel would immediately attract some attention. But ability alone wasn't enough. Researchers wanted to know where it came from. Was psychic sensitivity learned? Could it be activated through trauma? Could it be amplified by technology, or was it just inherited? Stewart believed that Montauk's operators had already reached their conclusion, and the abilities were supposedly in the blood. The children were allegedly questioned about their families, parents, godparents, countries of origin, medical conditions, religious backgrounds, military service, political connections, stories of unusual dreams, visions, mental illness, unexplained disappearances, or abilities that seemed to repeat across generations. The researchers weren't merely constructing a medical history, they were building a map. Stewart claimed certain families appeared over and over again in intelligence agencies, governments, banking systems, royal houses, secret societies, and occult organizations. Within the conspiracy, those families had been protected and carefully intermarried for centuries. Publicly, their power came from wealth and political access. Privately, though, Stewart believed they were preserving specific genetic traits. Some bloodlines supposedly produced children who were unusually receptive to mental programming. Others produced stronger psychic abilities. Some could perceive non-physical entities, and a small number, according to Stewart, possessed minds capable of interacting with the technology beneath Montauk without immediately breaking down. And that created two very different categories of, quote, subjects. The first were children who could be used, unfortunately. They were adaptable, replaceable, and easy to erase. Yep, runaways, children in the institutional care, and young people whose disappearances might not produce an immediate investigation. They became the bodies fed into the experiments. The The second group was a bit more valuable. These were children whose ancestry supposedly connected them to the people or entities behind the project. They weren't only test subjects, they were genetic material, and Stewart believed he belonged to that second group. So, the blood tests now. He described repeated medical examinations. There were blood samples being taken almost daily, skin samples, hair being pulled from the root, needles inserted into different areas of the body, ugh, electrical measurements, brain activity monitored while symbols or images flashed before him. Some procedures appeared almost to be pretty routine, and others just made absolutely no sense to Stewart. Researchers allegedly compared his physical reactions to psychic tasks. They monitored what happened inside of his body when he remote viewed and received a telepathic message or even just entered an alternate state. They weren't satisfied with knowing that something happened. They wanted to isolate the mechanism. If the ability could be identified biologically, perhaps it could be reproduced. A psychic child would no longer need to be discovered by chance. Maybe the project could create one. The possibility of that changed Montauk from a training program into a, you guessed it, breeding program. Stewart claimed the genetic operation had several goals. The first one was survive. You got to survive first. Many of the alleged Montauk boys could not withstand the procedures, and their bodies failed under the drugs, the radiation, the electromagnetic exposure, the trauma, and just all of the physical stress from each and every one of those things. Others survived physically, but returned mentally destroyed. A successful subject needed a body capable of enduring the experiment and a mind flexible enough to be fractured, programmed, and then put back into its ordinary life. The second goal was psychic performance. The ideal subject could remote view accurately, receive thoughts, project images, and interact with the time tunnel without losing contact with the destination. The third goal was obedience. A powerful psychic who resisted programming would be more dangerous to the project than a person with no ability at all. The perfect subject needed enormous mental potential with almost no control over when or what or how or why that potential was used. A weapon that could think, but only when commanded to think. And according to Stewart, selective breeding could bring those traits all together. So could genetic manipulation. And this is where his story becomes much stranger than anything we've covered in part 1, and even stranger than things in Stranger Things. Because Stewart did not believe the program was combining human traits with only other human traits. He claimed that these researchers were actually attempting to combine human biology with non-human genetic material. The small gray beings Stewart described were allegedly deeply involved in the medical side of the operation. They appeared around examination tables, they observed procedures, they collected reproductive material and tissue, which is classic if you're gray. Stewart claimed their interest in humanity was partly the result of a biological program within their own species. In many alien abduction stories, the Greys are described as physically fragile. Their bodies are pretty small and their limbs are really thin, and their skin almost appears as artificial. Their faces display little emotion, and their reproductive biology is either damaged, limited, or no longer functioning the way the human reproduction system is. And within that subset of conspiracy around the Greys, they need human genetic material because they can no longer sustain themselves without it. Human beings possess traits they lack: physical resilience, emotional range, sexual reproduction, and genetic diversity. And perhaps most importantly, something connected to consciousness that the Greys can imitate but can't naturally produce. Stewart claimed that the Greys were not necessarily the ultimate authority behind the program. They behaved more like technicians, and they performed the procedures and they maintained the equipment, mostly because they had more vibes with the equipment, like they knew how to program it, and they also monitored the developing subjects. But there was somebody or something else that decided what the program was trying to create. and those were the reptilians. The reptilian beings occupied a different position entirely. Stewart described them as tall, physically powerful, and really, really smart, really intelligent. Some were said to stand 7 feet tall or more. Their bodies appeared dense and heavily muscled. Their skin resembled scales, and their faces were elongated with eyes that could appear yellow, gold, or reddish, depending on the account. He also claimed certain reptilian entities could disguise themselves using a projected human appearance. That disguise did not physically change their body, it changed how people were seeing them, like a mental type of shapeshifter. They weren't changing shapes themselves, they were just changing the way you saw them. A reptilian figure could walk into a room appearing human. If the projection weakened, the human image might shimmer, break apart, or briefly reveal the larger being from beneath it. Stewart believed these beings came from a hierarchy connected to the Draco star system. Raise your hand if you've heard that before. In his later writings, he described them as an ancient species whose influence on humanity extended far, far beyond Montauk. They've been here for a while. That's a whole other deep dive we could take on the reptilian beings. Drop in the comments below if you want to go over greys or reptilians, because it's a fuck show, if you ask me. Anyway, back to it. According to his version, they had interfered with human civilizations for thousands of years. They shaped governments, they manipulated belief systems, placed representatives within powerful families, and used human conflict as a system of control. If the Greys wanted human biology to repair themselves, the reptilian entities wanted something completely different, and that was access. They supposedly needed bodies capable of functioning inside human society while carrying enough of their own genetic characteristics to remain controlled. That is where the bloodlines returned. Stewart believes some human families already contained traces of non-human ancestry, and this project was not the beginning of the hybridization process. It was refining something that had started generations earlier. Now, the alleged goal was not to reproduce a creature that looked alien. That would be pretty useless to anyone involved at this point. A visible hybrid could not attend school, and they couldn't enter politics or work inside intelligence agencies or move through any type of ordinary life without attracting unwanted attention. The ideal hybrid would appear completely human. It could speak normally, form relationships, have children, build a career, but underneath that appearance, it could carry neurological or genetic traits associated with the non-human group that helped create it. Perhaps it would possess enhanced psychic ability. Perhaps it would respond more easily to telepathic commands. Perhaps it could perceive the world in ways ordinary human beings could not. But most importantly, it might feel an instinctive loyalty to the group of people or things whose genetic material it carried. A person like that wouldn't need to know they were part of a program. They could just spend their time and in their entire life believing their choices were their own. They might be guided toward a particular profession, placed near a particular person, encouraged to marry into another selected family. Their children would continue the experiment, and in Montauk, or at least in this version of Montauk, it was not trying to build an army that could march out of Camp Hero. It was building people who could disappear into the population. Stewart's account included allegations of reproductive experiments involving both human subjects and non-human entities. Eggs and sperm were supposedly collected, embryos were created outside of the body, some were implanted into human women, others allegedly developed inside of artificial gestational systems. And women connected to alien abduction stories have often described pregnancies that appeared suddenly and then ended just as mysteriously. A pregnancy test might be positive, physical symptoms would start, and then another period of missing time, and the pregnancy would just be completely fucking gone. No ordinary miscarriage, no clear medical explanation, and later, during another alleged abduction, the woman might be shown a child and told or made to feel that it belonged to her. We've talked about this before. These children were often described as almost human. Their bodies were thin and their skin was like unusually pale, almost transparent sometimes. Their eyes were larger than expected. They sometimes appeared weak, as though they were unable to survive without super controlled conditions. And in some accounts, abductees were encouraged to touch or hold them because the hybrids could not develop emotionally without human contact. Stewart expanded this mythology into Montauk's program. He claimed that human reproduction was being used to create multiple generations of experimental beings. Early generations looked less human and could not survive easily outside of the facility, and later generations began to be more successful. But each generation brought the program closer to a being that possessed non-human abilities inside a conveniently human-looking body. But not every experiment worked, and the failed experiments had to be kept somewhere else. Yup. Can you even fucking imagine what that would look like? And this is where we bring Plum Island back into play, because it becomes important again. Remember what already existed at this island: restricted laboratories, animal holding facilities, isolated from the mainland, and incineration and decontamination systems. Researchers that were experienced in infecting, observing, containing, and disposing of living test subjects were already there. If Camp Hero's alleged genetic program produced something physically unstable, Plum Island offered a place where that subject could be studied without appearing on any public hospital record, or maybe even fucking destroyed. They would burn shit. Within the Montauk conspiracy, the rumored tunnels allowed biological, quote, materials to move between the two sites without ever traveling openly through Long Island. Samples could leave Camp Hero, animals could be brought in, failed experiments or organisms could be transferred out, and if something died, the body could be destroyed inside of a facility already equipped to dispose of contaminated remains. Just as a side note, there's no confirmed evidence that Plum Island conducted human-alien hybrid experiments, but who the fuck cares, because why would they tell us anyway? Its documented mission centered around foreign animal diseases. We already went through this, but just to recap, and threats to livestock. That real mission gave the rumors something they rarely possessed, and that was infrastructure. Plum Island already had all the shit that you need to be able to get rid of alien hybrid experiments gone wrong. It had a biological warfare history, and for most people living nearby, almost everything happened there that it just remained invisible, and that allowed stories to grow. The Montauk conspiracy theory claims that researchers experimented with combining genetic characteristics from different animals, but the purpose itself was not always clear, and some creatures may have been attempts to create stronger biological forms. Others could have been designed to test how manipulated tissue responded to radiation or pathogens or electromagnetic exposure. Still, others were allegedly the result of trying to place non-human genetic material inside of terrestrial animals before attempting to process it on people. This would make animals the preliminary stage, if you will. If a foreign sequence killed an animal immediately, it would never reach a human subject, and if the animal survived, researchers could observe how the body developed. Did the bones change? Did the nervous system behave differently? There it is again. Did it display an unexpected ability to heal? Could it reproduce? And if it escaped, would anyone know what they were looking at? That's a no. That's a big ol' fat no. The story began attaching itself to every strange animal reported near eastern Long Island, because unusual tracks started popping up, and mutated or mutilated livestock, missing pets started to be a thing. Carcasses that were too decomposed to identify immediately started showing up. Local wildlife behaving in ways that residents considered abnormal. And most of these incidents that was happening in the area had possible explanations, but the geography made every malformed body feel like evidence to the public. And there was 2 restricted government facilities nearby. One was rumored to manipulate genetics, and the other was experimented on animals. Anything unrecognizable that appeared between the two became part of the Montauk conspiracy. And Stewart's claims were not limited to the Greys and reptilian beings. He described a much larger non-human presence surrounding the project. Some entities appeared almost human, others were so physically different that he believed they originated outside any normal branch of life on Earth. There were alleged beings connected to Sirius, others linked to Orion or Regal or the Pleiades. Some communicated through speech, some used direct telepathy. Others supposedly existed partly outside of physical reality and required technology or a biological host to remain present in our world. Stewart did not describe them as one united extraterrestrial civilization either. They had competing interests. Different groups wanted different things from humanity, and some were allegedly interested in genetics. Some wanted territory, some studied consciousness, some viewed human beings as resources or money. Others claimed they were trying to protect humanity from interference while quietly interfering themselves. Again, this made Montauk less like a secret government laboratory and more like a negotiation site, a place where human agencies traded access for technology because we're greedy. And according to Swerdlow, the American operators wanted weapons, surveillance systems, and mind control methods, and the ability to move through time. The non-human groups wanted bodies, DNA, emotional data, and permission to continue their own experiments. Neither side trusted the other, and both believed they were capable of controlling the arrangement, and the children were trapped between the two. Stewart believed technology from these non-human groups helped Montauk push past the limits of human engineering. The time tunnel, psychic amplification, the ability to project convincing images directly into the mind, devices capable of separating consciousness from the human body, systems that could allegedly manipulate cellular development or accelerate healing. But the transfer was not as simple as an alien handing over a machine. Technology designed for a non-human nervous system might be a little useless to us. A device operated through telepathy would require a telepathic operator, and a system that responded to consciousness would need a human mind capable of producing the correct signal. That gave Montauk children another purpose. They were interfaces. Human minds adapted to operate technology human engineers could not fully understand. Duncan had allegedly used the chair to translate thought into physical events, and Stewart claimed that children like Duncan were trained to communicate with systems that did not use ordinary controls. There was no keyboard, there was no switch, no written command of any kind. The machine responded to images, emotions, symbols, and focused intention. The language of hyperspace was not merely part of programming. It was allegedly the language of technology itself. And a child whose mind had been fractured, conditioned, and rebuilt could be shaped to speak it, which leads us to the triple helix. Stewart would later describe himself as possessing an unusual energetic structure, sometimes referred to in Montauk material as a triple helix or triple lattice. This should not be confused with a medically documented third strand of physical DNA. In Stewart's system, the idea was partly biological and partly metaphysical. He believed human beings possessed energetic patterns surrounding or interacting with the physical body. Most people operated within one basic structure, and certain Montauk subjects possessed additional layers that allowed them to process more information or access altered states more easily and interact with multiple levels of reality. Within his account, Duncan Cameron was unusual. Stewart believed his own structure was even more complex. That supposedly made him capable of holding multiple programs, surviving experiences that destroyed other subjects, and moving through the time tunnel while retaining fragments of what he saw. It also made him difficult to control. The more compartments the project created, the more places his original consciousness had to hide. And according to Stewart, a piece of him remained aware throughout the experiments, watching, taking notes, and remembering, waiting for the opportunity to surface. And Stewart claimed that some subjects did not survive intact. Some died during the physical experiments, some were lost inside of the time tunnels, and some returned with catastrophic injuries. Others came back physically alive, but mentally unreachable. A child might stare without responding, or speak in a language that nobody recognized, describe a family or home that had never even existed, and some even allegedly returned older than when they entered. Others appeared to have experienced years somewhere else while only hours had passed at Montauk. There were also claims that a subject could return to the wrong point in the facility's timeline. A child sent through the tunnel in 1 year might appear years later or even earlier. And if that happened, the project faced an impossible problem. What do you do with a person who exists in the wrong time? And according to Stewart, some were reprogrammed and returned into society. Some were given new identities. Some remained underground, and some were simply removed. That is one of the ugliest implications inside of the entire Montauk story. If the project truly selected children who were already easy to overlook, there may have never even been a complete list of those who did enter the facility, which means no enrollment record, no signed consent form, no parent waiting outside to pick up their kid like it's the school drop off, no official document connecting the child to Camp Hero. And if they died, the project didn't have to explain their death, nor did they really care. They had one mission, and it only had to maintain the disappearance. At first, when you look at this objectively, the cruelty beneath Montauk appeared to serve a practical purpose. Break the mind, create compartments, install commands, and erase the memory. But Stewart came to believe trauma did something else entirely. Extreme fear changed subjects' consciousness. At the moment the child believed death was unavoidable, ordinary perception could collapse. The mind just separated from the body, and time started to behave differently. The child became more physically open, and within the program's logic, terror was not merely a way to force obedience, it was a doorway. The stronger the trauma, the wider the doorway could open, and that might allow the subject to remote view more clearly, receive telepathic communication, or interact with those entities normally that were hidden from previous human perception. The researchers were deliberately pushing children to the boundary between life and death because something became accessible there. And Stewart believed the reptilian entities fed on emotional energy produced during those moments. Fear was not an accidental byproduct, it was part of the exchange. The human operators received fractured psychic subject, and the entities received whatever the suffering generated. That would explain why the program remained so excessively cruel even after the children learned to obey. Pain wasn't only creating the weapon, it was feeding someone else in the room. So who controlled Montauk? By the time Stewart began assembling his memories, he no longer believed Montauk belonged to one government agency. The military provided the security, intelligence personnel managed information and programming, scientists operated the equipment, private contractors may have developed technology without understanding the larger system, and the non-human groups provided knowledge, devices, or access to places human beings could not reach alone. Each department knew only enough to perform its own task, much like the minds they were trying to split. A technician could spend years maintaining a machine without knowing what appeared when it was activated. A doctor could collect tissue without being told where the samples went, and a guard might move a child between rooms without knowing the child's name. Compartmentalization protected the entire operation. No singular worker needed to understand Montauk. They only needed to obey their part of it. But at the highest level, Stewart believed that this distinction between human and non-human leadership had disappeared. The people giving orders may have belonged to the same bloodlines the project was preserving. Some may have been hybrids, others may have been human beings under psychic control. And some, if Stewart was right, only looked human when the technology around them was working correctly. Montauk was supposedly built to create control, yet the deeper the project went, the less clear it became. Who was controlling whom? Stewart described encounters in which he believed he was shown possible futures. Cities that were destroyed, governments reorganized, populations controlled through absolute terror, human beings monitored so completely that private thought itself became almost impossible. Some of these futures appeared to follow wars or engineered catastrophes, and others just emerged gradually. People surrendered freedom because they believed greater control would keep them safe, and the Montauk technology would not need to be installed openly. Its descendants could have been hidden inside communication systems, entertainment, medicine, military surveillance, or devices people willingly brought into their homes. Ooh, does that not just send a fucking shiver down your spine? Stewart believed the ultimate goal was never simply to assassinate one target or control one population. It was to create a civilization that programmed itself. A world where people absorbed their triggers voluntarily, where they accepted manufactured memories, where symbols and images shaped behavior before conscious thought could intervene, where the most effective prison only existed inside of the mind. That was the future Montauk was allegedly preparing for, but the genetic program introduced a danger its operators may not have ever anticipated. If abilities could be inherited, so could resistance. A child bred to receive telepathic commands might eventually learn to recognize them, and a child trained to enter other minds might discover who was entering theirs. A person engineered to operate the system might also learn how to destroy it. And Stewart believed that that's why the program eventually became afraid of its own subjects. They had created children capable of seeing behind the machinery. And once those children began remembering, Montauk could no longer guarantee that the story would remain underground. But the public would not see a surviving child emerge from Camp Hero. What appeared next was something much harder to explain. It had 4 legs, a nearly hairless body, elongated face that looked almost like a beak, and in the summer of 2008, it washed ashore on a beach less than 2 miles from the ruins of the Montauk Project. Which brings us to July 12, 2008. 3 friends went to Ditch Plains Beach in Montauk. The shoreline was familiar, there was sand, low waves, and people just enjoying the summer. Then, one woman noticed something lying near the water. At first, it looked like a dead animal, but the closer they moved, the harder it became to identify. The body was swollen and mostly hairless. Its legs looked strangely long. The paws or feet were difficult to make out clearly, and the face appeared narrow, ending in a hard projection that looked less like an ordinary snout and more like a beak. One of the women, Jenna Hewitt, photographed it. And that photograph escaped long before anyone decided what that animal was. It moved through email chains, blogs, newspapers, and television. People proposed things like dogs, pigs, turtles, rodents, maybe, and creatures no biologist had ever documented. Someone noticed where it had appeared: Montauk, a place associated with a creature allegedly produced inside a psychic experiment. And across the water sat Plum Island, where the federal government really did conduct restricted animal research. The story wrote itself. Whatever had washed ashore, people decided, had escaped from somewhere. The only question was which facility had created it. And before anyone could properly examine the body of this creature, it disappeared. Much like all of the evidence, much like the children, much like every version of this story, until it all came crashing back onto that beach in 2008. And that is where I'm going to leave Montauk for now, because the next part of this is a TV show called Stranger Things. What do you think happened at Montauk? Do you think that this could be a real thing that our government did in partnership with other Black Ops groups? What's going on? Is it still going on? If you are still with me, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Spicy Alien After Dark. Boob shake! And I will see you guys in the next episode. Bye!